This is Chosen PLLC. Welcome to Clinician Conversations, where mental health professionals talk about how they cope with navigating life challenges.
All right. So, hello and welcome to another episode of Clinician Conversations. We are glad to have you here with us today. Today we have Jill Chastain, licensed professional counselor, Benjamin Stoops, licensed professional counselor, Laurel Huff, licensed professional counselor, and brand new therapist with us. Well, not new to therapy, but new to us, Heather Hemphill, licensed professional counselor and limited license marriage and family therapist, and myself, Dr. Leatrice Brooks, licensed psychologist. So today we are going to be talking about boundaries. Ooh. Boundaries is a topic that often comes up in therapy. It is something that we have to learn to do over and over and over and over again. It is something that many people struggle with because we find differences in the way that we approach boundaries for ourselves, boundaries in relationships with other people, the different kinds of relationships that we have, whether it's work relationships, romantic relationships, relationships with children, relationships with friends. Boundaries are always there. There's even a series of books called Boundaries to help you to learn how to do it with various groups of people. And so today we're just going to start with having a general conversation about boundaries, some of the ways in which we see it coming up in the conversations that we have with clients, but also how boundaries show up in our own lives, how we have had to implement strategies for boundaries, how we know when boundaries are needed in a particular relationship. And so that's what we're going to share with you today. And let's get started.
Cool. Yeah, welcome again, Heather. It's great to have a new person to watch during the VOD and such and things. But I guess I'll start out because this comes up all the time in therapy sessions, and it comes up in my own life too. And one of the huge boundaries to making boundaries seems to be for not only myself but clients. A lot of times it feels like we're being mean to people by saying, no, you can't be in my life, you can't be in my inner circle. I don't know if that's an experience any of you all have had with clients or yourselves, if you're feeling kind of, oh, I said no to that person, what if they don't like me, I'm setting this boundary. Ooh, kind of that nervousness.
I think even taking it a step back, because I didn't grow up. I mean, I guess boundaries were talked about a little bit, but it was more punitive and extreme. So, what does it look like, first of all? And hey, I don't want to do this, feeling overwhelmed. A lot of those emotions I notice with pretty much everybody that I do therapy with when boundaries comes up. At least that's been my impression.
I
Mm-hmm.
also I also think that with boundaries, a lot of people don't understand what a boundary really is. A lot of times they're setting those boundaries because they want to force someone else to do something. And really that boundary is all about you and what your needs are. So that's a big line that I have with my clients a lot of the times, is just getting them to really recognize what a boundary actually is.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
The
And
Agreed.
word that came up,
sometimes, oh, go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I was going to say, to kind of continue with that, sometimes I won't use the word boundary for a while, especially if I can sense that that is still kind of a shift with that's okay. I will use the word maybe like safety, how do you feel safe or more comfortable or something like that, to kind of get the brain going that, yeah, this is something that is good for me. It's not like I'm going on a terrible diet, that, you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yes, yes. Yeah,
That's
that
the
boundary
exact
is a
verbiage.
great. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. That's the exact verbiage I use too, Laurel, is that, this is boundaries are all about making you feel safe and making you feel secure. And it's about, what will you tolerate, what won't you tolerate, and then how to verbalize that to other people. So
Yeah. Well, and for a boundary, I like to always tell people it's really giving other people an opportunity to grow, because you're saying no. So it's putting that ball in their court to help them to understand, oh, what they're doing is not acceptable and it needs to in some way, shape, or form change. And if they're going to do that, they have to do something. It's putting that opportunity for them to grow, change, learn something new. It's not meant to be, I hate you, get out. Although sometimes I suppose it could be that, but it really is that ability to, like you were saying, it's about you protecting yourself from something that's not supposed to be in your life and saying, no, I'm giving this back to you. You hang on to it. I'm not dealing with it, kind of a thing. So it's a very positive kind of thing to do.
Yeah.
One word that came up for me when you were talking before, Benjamin, was limits. Boundaries are about limits. Because I think to Heather's point, when we often talk about boundaries, people think of it as an extreme, or they think of it like very intensely, or they think of it from like a dichotomy perspective. Either we have this or we don't, but it's really about limits. So how do I create a space that feels good for me, that honors who I am, what it is that I want, what's okay for me and what's not okay for me? And there is a gradation, big word, right, to limits or to boundaries. So it's not that all or nothing. It's this part is okay for me and this part is not okay for me. I'm okay at this level. I'm not okay at this level. So like one example that comes up sometimes, because families sometimes or parents have a difficult time establishing certain kinds of limits and boundaries with kids, but there's something called a forced choice. So one example that I often give with forced choices is, you want to give your kid autonomy or freedom to be able to make decisions on their own. And so you might say, well, you can pick out your clothes or you can pick out your pajamas. Okay, so here's a boundary. You can pick out your pajamas. Do you want the blue ones or the yellow ones?
There you go.
Right? It's a limit. It's a choice. We not going to be here all day rumbling through all of these pajamas. You get one or the other. That's a limit. It's a boundary. It helps you to protect your sanity. It helps you to protect your time from being here all night trying to figure it out. It gives some direction to how it is that you want this interaction to happen. But it's the limits that you place on relationships to help the relationship work well together. Because that's the piece that I think people also miss, that in order for this to work well together, we have to have these things in place. And there are boundaries and limits everywhere, right? Like, that's what traffic lights are about. That's what laws are about. Like they're everywhere. But for whatever reason, like Laura was saying, when we hear that word, people just like there are negative connotations associated with it.
Yeah.
And it's really healthy. And in relationships, sometimes what I found too, sometimes people have problems and there's that guilt that they feel for setting limits. And sometimes it's because what they're getting from it. Like some people, they overextend themselves or don't have any boundaries because they're getting something out of it, whether it's acceptance or approval or value. So they're getting something out of it too, even though they're overextending themselves and complaining about overextending themselves. And people will let you go as far beyond your limits as you allow them to, and it's our responsibility to rein them back in. And I use this example with my clients and even in my life. And I know, Leatrice, you've heard this before. We were leaving out in the parking lot. I think it was a couple years ago, and there's a fence that separates our parking lot at the practice from the golf course. And there were, I think it was like 4 or 5 deer trying to get over the fence over to the golf course. And they kept running head first into the fence, and then they would fall down and they'd run, fall down, run and fall down. It was the strangest thing to see. And what came up for me is it's kind of like that with our boundaries. When we set those limits, people are going to protest them at first, and they're going to try to hit up against them. And that fence to me represented that boundary or that limit, and not letting people over. When they try to get over that limit, you have to stand strong and not let them through. And
Yeah.
the deer ended up going a different way. So
Mhm.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
here's what happens when we don't set boundary or we don't adhere to our own boundaries, then that's when we find ourselves feeling disgruntled in relationships or resentment, or we have these like under our breath conversations. We have an attitude, we're snappy at people, and it's because there's something that's not working for me that I'm not attending to. And also the recognizing that I have the responsibility to attend to it, to what it is that I need. And that's okay, regardless of somebody else's reaction, for me to attend to my needs. And one thing I like to say in relationships is whenever one person changes in a relationship, the other person has to change because the dynamics are now different. So you're
Mhm.
going to have to do something, and either you're going to go with the flow, like, okay, yep, I'm on board with that, or you're going to decide not to. And that's okay too, because if you can't respect or adhere to what's good for me, then I have to question whether or not you have my best interests at heart. And maybe we're not going in the same direction like I thought we were. And then maybe there's something different to process, because now I got to cope with this loss of
Yeah.
relationship, because that's a reality when we set boundaries and maintain them.
Yeah. That's true. Well, I think you guys bring up a good point of just because somebody protests your boundaries does not mean that the boundary is wrong or bad.
Mhm.
And that sometimes I think that's what might get into our mindset is, oh, they're protesting. Am I doing something wrong, bad, or so? And then we kind of, acquiesce. We go back and say, oh no, I think I shouldn't do this, and we kind of go back in our shell when we should probably push that boundary and continue with it. And like you were saying, Beatrice, of learning from it and changing yourself, expecting the other person to change, so that relationship is more healthy, or maybe gone. Maybe we don't need that relationship anymore. So yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes I also recommend starting really small, kind of a lower risk kind of thing. And you also don't have to necessarily tell the other person that you're setting the boundary.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah, they'll notice, hopefully.
yes.
If they don't, then that's another thing to think about. It's
Yeah.
just, you don't notice when
Yeah.
I change? How important am I to you? Kind of thing. So yeah.
I think boundaries also help us to honor ourselves and our needs and what's important to us. Unfortunately, I think we are often socialized to minimize the importance of ourselves and what we need, right? We're taught to adjust and be adapters to what everybody else needs and really not consider what's going to help us to be healthy. So that part of like boundaries are not about being mean. It's about what is going to create a healthy space for me and what kind of environment or relationship am I able to function and show up consistently as my best self. And so it's when you notice that in whatever the situation is, like, I'm not showing up the way that I want to show up. I'm not feeling good about how this is going. Then figure out what it is and what's happening. And if establishing a boundary or tightening up a boundary or revisiting a boundary could be the answer of what's needed. And I think too, there's also this piece of we don't, everybody doesn't function the same way. Like Laurel, you were talking about, the way that you grew up. People grew up differently, and some people grew up where boundaries were not, not at all anywhere on the radar. Some people grew up where boundaries were everywhere and it was like restrictive. And so the way that we process through it is not the way that other people process through it. And just because we have the conversation, it doesn't mean that it's going to be a negative experience. We can communicate. I know. So, like in my big word, theoretical orientation, and the way that I approach therapy, there's a concept called corrective emotional experience. And it is the most amazing thing to have a corrective emotional experience. And so it's like when you have this moment where you've had an experience before, and in this situation, it did not go well, but then you have a similar experience and it goes really well, it corrects your emotions around that experience. And so sometimes we can have a different experience with establishing boundaries, and maybe this person is not going to react as intensely as the other person did who scared us away from boundaries for life.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And it's important to identify what boundaries. I had to learn that too. Like what boundaries do I need to set for me in certain relationships? I didn't know what I needed and just figuring that out. So I have to know so that I can, request that from the other person.
Yeah.
So it's just so important. There's a proverb that says, uh, uh, having no boundaries, I'm paraphrasing, having no boundaries is like a city without walls. That means
Mhm.
anyone can come in and do anything. And like Dr. Brooks said earlier, the boundaries are so important. I mean, limits, there's limits, love with limits, in relationship. It has to have that. Like with with children, we love them, but there has to be limits because they'll hurt themselves. Like you give a 5-year-old keys to the car because they want to drive, and it's not safe. They may want to, but it's not safe. So a lot of times boundaries can be from a protection. There's so many facets of it, but when you look at a parent-child relationship or there's some corrective and some safety measures in there too. That's important.
Well, another thing that Dr. Brooks had mentioned was about getting needs met. And I think with boundaries, it helps people to understand what needs you have and how to meet those needs. And I think that's a really critical thing. Sometimes I think we just make the assumption that everybody should just know what I want, right? That mind reading. And those boundaries, if they're set and they're known and, we put those out there, then people know how to meet our needs, rather than us sitting back going, why isn't anybody addressing this? Why aren't they seeing to what is important to me? So it serves that purpose of not only setting those limits, but also getting what we need out of that relationship.
Very
I know
true.
one boundary that I'm currently being super intentional about is my calendar. And like this morning, I got an email, somebody trying to get on my calendar. And I was like, oh, I don't know, we might be. I'm like, but I really need to get this done so we can move on to the next thing. So am I going to sacrifice this time to go ahead and do this? And when can I do it at a time that I'm not going to have an attitude about the fact that I've added another meeting to my calendar? There's some things that I'm like, we are scheduling in April because I cannot, like, I'm looking at the layout of it and I'm like, I cannot. I can't. It's going to cost me too much of myself to add this to the calendar. And I know, especially in talking to like professionals or people that have a lot of stuff, that can be a hard area is, to have a boundary with your calendar. And boundaries are a form of self-care,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah, especially if
Yeah.
you're in really toxic, abusive kind of relationships. It's safety, it's self-care. It can be a system by which you can get free of really bad relationships, and so they're extremely, extremely important things to not only understand, but to aggressively enact in your life and defend, kind of like the city walls that Jill was talking about. To envision that you have a wall and there's a gate at that wall, and you let it up for certain people, and some people just get to stay outside on the outside your wall, and they can call over and say hi, and you can say hi to the other side, and that's fine, and that's good enough, and they can keep walking, go to somebody else's city and see if they want to hang out there. And that having some people in your life that say, that's okay to just do that. Don't let them in your life. That's fine. And to be able to validate that boundary for you, it's really nice. Which is kind of sometimes our role as therapists is saying, yeah, that's just fine. You don't let that person in your world. It's okay. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, that or the figuring out at what level, to what
Hmm.
degree can this person be engaged with
Yeah.
me? Like
Because that's
this,
typically harder. Yeah,
say it
Yeah.
again.
that's typically harder.
Mm-hmm.
Like if they got through the gate, but they're not in the fortress, what does that look like?
That
Yeah.
is hard.
Yeah.
I know sometimes I struggle with um if somebody is in and then I'm like, this is not working. It's like how do I get you out without totally crushing you? Because I don't want to do that either, but I'm also very aware that this is not working for me. Like this is costing me something. And there's strategies for that, and I do it, but it's one of those like internal conversations that you have that you really wish you didn't have to have, to say like, no, I'm gonna have to tighten up this boundary, and this person is probably going to not like it, and I'm just gonna have to deal with that because that's what's healthy for me. Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
So, all right. Any other thoughts? Because I know we were talking about jumping into some specific areas as it relates to boundaries as we move forward with this conversation, jumping into different areas and other broadcasts. But any other general thoughts about boundaries?
Boundaries are needed. They're vital. And even I'm a therapist and I'm learning in my own life. I've gotten much better. And that's something that I had to learn too, because it's just keep going. I just had, work hard, keep going. And just even when I was in another career field in corporate America, it was just go, 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 and learning to no, make that schedule, not just fill up your schedule, take that time. So I'm self-care, I'm all about that too, but I'm still working on the scheduling, like, for personal and business, just trying to manage all of that, and being able to say no sometimes, or realize that I can't do it. And rather than stress myself out, because I'll just get quiet and go in go mode and try to get everything on the calendar. But now I'm getting much, much better with like, nope, that's too much. And let me just move this over, which is definitely growth for me, because I just keep going. I can do all of this. I can do it. I can do it. It's like, no, it's too much.
And that brings up for me then the messages that we tell ourselves about this is too much. Yeah. Heather?
I was going to say, just giving yourself a little grace, even if you're not 100% perfect with your boundaries and you recognize, hey, I've taken on too much, that's okay. You're learning, right? And just giving a little bit of, grace to yourself and grace to other people too, because it's going to take them a while to learn those boundaries as well.
Yep. Going to end up having to train them with your own behavior a little bit. And it's a journey and a process, which my clients always roll their eyes at me when I do that. Like, everything has a journey with you, isn't it, Benjamin? Like, yeah, it is. Sorry. Just, you can't have it all now. You're going to learn. You're going to mess up sometimes. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to learn from them. You're going to adjust. And it's just this lifelong process of advocating yourself and becoming more healthy. You're just not going to be a perfect ninja level person at this. I mean, I don't think any of us are perfect at the boundaries thing. Even as therapists, I mean, we are still humans, and we sometimes have struggles and are learning constantly in these areas. So, yeah, if we don't have it all figured out, certainly our clients shouldn't expect themselves to either.
Because
So,
it's not a black and white something,
right.
Every time you add something new into your life, you need to reassess your boundaries
Yeah.
because they're going to be impacted. Whether it's a new responsibility, a new relationship, a new something, even if it's like, okay, well, I want to go and do this thing on the weekend. Well, how does that fit in with the boundaries I have around my time over the weekend? What am I going to need? I was just looking at that today. I was like, oh, there's an event that might want to go to on Saturday, but oh, I got this thing late on Friday. I don't know if I'm going to make it to the Saturday one, because after the way that this week went, I might need to chill out after Friday. So might not be making it on Saturday. So it's just the flow of life. And once we get to a space where we can normalize it and just recognize this is the work that we have to do to live and be happy and be successful, then you do it. It just is.
Yeah.
And when we have boundaries, we're better for ourselves and other people, for the people in our lives too.
Any final thoughts, Laurel?
I was just going to say, I think of it like a muscle too. So it's always going to be hard in some areas. You don't kind of know because things ebb and flow. But I think getting used to that and the trust that you have and kind of sitting with yourself and assessing that too. Like, what do I need? Where am I at? What's changed? You can get into a rhythm with that, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that kind of removes the shame. I like to use the shame word. The more we talk about it and that it's okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you all for jumping in on the topic today and also sharing your own experiences with boundaries. So, as we move forward, keep an eye out for future broadcasts about boundaries in relationships and at work, boundaries for yourself. Just look for the different topics on how to establish boundaries in different areas and some of the challenges with establishing boundaries in particular areas. So until next time, have a great day, week, month, year.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.